Terry's day started with the previous shift dragging inmate Harrison from his cell. The two officers, old pros at this, had him cuffed up and held under each arm, the yard sergeant coming behind as he manfully attempted to hold the inmate's kicking legs. Sergeant Lehman wasn't a small guy, somewhere between a bodybuilder and a sideshow strongman, and even he was having trouble keeping a hold of the struggling inmate. Harrison was 6.5 feet tall, and mostly ankles and elbows. As they pulled him out, he was screaming loud enough to shake the cobwebs in the rafters. "Make it stop! Make it stop! Make it stop talking!" Terry grabbed a leg as he tried to help Lehman get the struggling man off the quad. Terry, Officer Greenwood to his charges, had just come in for his first shift of the week, and he couldn't think of a more tumultuous way to begin it. He had expected that they were just taking him to the shower. He stank and was likely being forced to clean himself. But they headed straight out of the quad and into the sally port, where Officer Carr was waiting with the restraint chair. "What the hell happened?" Terry asked, after the 5 of them managed to wrestle the struggling man into the chair and secure the straps. "We don't know. He's been kind of quiet all day, but just as the sun started to go down, he starts screaming and banging and causing a fuss. We had Perry come down here to talk to him, but not even he could get him to settle down." "Really? Perry couldn't get anything out of him? That dude could charm the birdies from the trees." "Nope, couldn't get a word in edgewise. He said all he was doing was gibbering about someone in the cell talking to him. We're going to take him down to medical for observation. Do me a favor and put in some paperwork on that sink in there. He broke it while he was spazzing out." Terry said he would, and with that they were off and rolling towards the medical pavilion. Harrison continued to buck as they rolled away, his eyes going towards the cell he had left. His eyes were wide and white, crazed like a horse's eyes, and Terry felt a sliver of fear creep into him. What had he seen that had scared him so much? Would Terry see it too? Terry hoped not, as he headed for the station. Officer Tobry was there, as well as Sergeant Wayne, and the cocky young officer grinned at him as Terry walked up the stairs into the station proper. "Guess we'll have to change our count before we get started. Doesn't look like Harrison's going to be back anytime soon." Terry shrugged. "I guess so. He seemed pretty rattled." "He's been rattled since he got here. Dude takes enough pills to keep his sight grade in check, but he's one bad day away from losing his marbles." Tombry clapped him on the shoulder, Terry turning to look at him as he cocked his head back towards the door. "Come on, man. Let's get these degenerates counted." Terry nodded as he followed him, sliding his notebook out as he prepared to count the dorm. As they came into Quad 4, Terry couldn't help but glance at Harrison's old cell. The door was open, and the inside hung blackly in the lighted quad. The dying light through the window made a smoky square on the floor, and in that strange light, Terry felt that he could see something on the far wall. He had thought someone was hiding in there before he remembered that no one could be in there. The wing was secured. No one was capable of leaving their cells or moving around, and when he walked past the door, he stopped for a few seconds as he studied the spot on the back of the cell. Taking out his flashlight, he shone it in and gasped as he tried to keep a grip on it. It had fallen on something on the back of the cell that looked surprisingly like a face. He stood there for a count of 5, just staring at the wall, but the longer he looked at the spot, the less it looked like the face he thought he'd seen at the start. The face he had seen had been that of a stunted old man, the kind with a mischievous face that you watched your kids around. The more he looked at him, though, the less it looked like anything more than a swirl of paint on the back wall. It was silly to think about. It could have been anything, but as he looked at it, the more he could see that face lying just below the painted surface. "See something you like in there?" came a voice in his ear, and Terry jumped about a foot. Taubrey had come down after counting the upstairs and found Terry just standing there, looking into the cell. "Thought I saw..." But Terry thought better of it before telling Taubrey about the face. "Some graffiti or something. I was going to write it up, but I guess it's nothing." Taubrey shrugged. "Looks like he slagged the sink, though. Guess we got to write him up for that." Terry nodded, and the two of them moved back to the station to give their numbers to the sergeant. That was how it started, and it was a moment that Terry would reflect on often. Terry arrived home around 7 the next morning, and fell into bed in his uniform. It had been a hell of a night, and not just because of Harrison. He and Taubrey had gone about their usual duties, handing out mail, checking on the nightly chore list, but it seemed that something always drew them back to Quad 4. Some kind of fracas always dragged them back to the floor, and it was the busiest it had ever been. There had been 2 fights, one of them requiring help to break up, and 3 different inmates had been taken to confinement after lights out when they started kicking doors. Terry was usually pretty good at talking to them, but tonight there'd been no chance for communication. They kept yelling that people were talking to them, telling them things they didn't want to hear, and they wanted them to stop. In the end, they had sent 6 people to confinement, and it had taken all night to pack their property. On top of that, there were the weird noises in Quad 4 that night. Terry could believe that they were hearing strange whispers, because he could hear them too. Every time he went out to do a round, every time he found himself out there packing property, whenever he was pulling people apart or making the rabble go back to their cells, he could hear a low whisper that permeated everything out there. It was a small, ugly little voice, the voice of a witch in a kid's story, and it told Terry how worthless he was all night. It slid across his skin like a wire brush, and he came to dread the time he spent out on the quad. Strangely, it also seemed to be trying to lure him into Harrison's old cell. As he fell into an exhausted sleep, he could almost hear the words again. "Scurry, scurry, little mouse. You don't dare come into my home. I taste your fear, weakling. You don't have the sand to come face me. Step inside and see how much of a man you really are." He could see that face again, working its way from the wall, rising from the painted surface as the features began to come out. He was looking at the worn face of a wicked old warlock, looking for someone to draw into hell to take his place, and Terry was powerless to stop it as he held his face in the beam of that flashlight. He was aware of walking towards it, slowly but surely, and the closer he got, the less he wanted to. The face got bigger and bigger, taking up the wall as it grew, and the mouth opened to reveal rows of razor-sharp teeth. When it opened, the teeth attempting to clamp on him, Terry woke up with a furious start. He didn't sleep well that day, and it showed as he stumbled into F-dorm that night. Tobry whistled as he stumbled up the stairs. "You look like hell, Greenwood. Not getting sick, are you?" Terry shook his head, but he honestly felt sick. He had managed to fall asleep after a series of bad dreams that morning, and woken up just in time to see that he had 20 minutes to get to work. Given that it took 30 minutes to drive to work, Terry was pretty glad that he had slept in his uniform. It was a little rumpled, but he threw his coat on and ran out the door, stopping by the kitchen long enough to grab a TV dinner out of the freezer and pull his boots on before he ran out in his sock feet. He had been about 5 minutes late, speeding the whole way there, and his captain had thankfully been understanding. "Well, hopefully tonight is less of a 3-ring circus than last night," Tobry said. "Come on, partner, let's get this show on the road." Right off the rip, though, the shift began to list. Terry found 2 empty beds where inmates had been the day before, their roommates telling them how they'd been taken to confinement after getting mouthy. The door to Harrison's cell had been closed, but it did nothing to cut the sounds of the spidery whispers that Terry had heard last night. He tried to tell himself that he was remembering it wrong, that the whisper was something he had heard in his dream and attributed to his time in Quad 4 yesterday. But as he stood before that closed door, he could hear that caustic scuttling across his senses. "Open the door, weakling. Don't worry. I won't bite." The voice sounded pleased with its little joke, but Terry found that he didn't dare open that door and take a look. That night, he and Tobry were absolutely slammed. They had to break up another fight, and after lights out, they had several others kicking the door. It got so bad, Terry finally just turned the TV on out there, anything to dampen the whispers they all could hear. It helped a little, but there was a lot of grumbling amongst the cells when Terry went to do his rounds. He didn't doubt they could hear it. Terry could hear it, and it seemed to get louder every time he walked past the cell they had taken Harrison from. When he looked through the little glass window, Terry thought he could see eyes looking back at him. They reflected like a dog's eyes, red and sparkling in the light of his flashlight, but the wall was still flat and featureless. As the 2 of them left the next morning, Tobry clapped him on the shoulder and reminded him that, hey, at least he had the next 2 days off. We can rest up for the long weekend to come, and hopefully it won't be as bad as these 2 we've just had. Terry hoped so, but as he fell into bed again, the dream was waiting for him. It was the same thing as the day before. He was alone in the quad, the cells empty and their doors open and gaping. The lights seemed to buzz darker in their cages tonight, and the face snickered as it pushed its way through the wall. The wrinkles on its skin made it look like a carved wooden thing, but its eyes glowed with mirth. It grew larger and larger as Terry watched, held captive by the thing in the beam of his light, and as the face pushed out of the wall, it slithered free on a long tail of flesh. Terry could see a body pushing its way behind it, the majority trapped behind the paint, but as it opened its mouth wide to bite him, he realized it hardly needed anything but that long, trailing flesh tumor and its mouth of pointy teeth. He spent that first day in a state of perpetual doze. He would fall asleep, and the dream would be waiting for him. The monster would come slithering out of the wall, ready to bite, and Terry could do nothing but stand there and watch it happen in the beam of its flashlight. It bit him again and again and again, each bite burning as he came awake. Terry was limping by the time he got up on Thursday morning in the wee hours, and as he sat watching TV, his legs itched from the bites. He could feel something like infection working its way up them, but they looked the same as they always had. He stayed awake most of Thursday, taking cat naps in his recliner, but even then he was constantly falling back into the dream. By Friday, Terry was exhausted, but he couldn't afford to call out. He put on a fresh uniform as he staggered out the door, not sure he had the energy to do much more than shamble to his post and sit down. That was the night that Carter decided to take a hostage, and the creature decided to leave his dreams and enter the real world. Carter had the cell next to Harrison's. He'd been kicking on the second night and should have technically been taken to confinement, but the sergeant over there had said they were out of room and asked Terry to try to work things out without resorting to rehoming him in the box. He had quieted once the TV had come on, but Carter still looked shell-shocked when they let him out of the dorm for breakfast that morning. He had a haunted expression as the two officers conducted their first count, and when his roommate asked Terry if he could swap cells, Terry gave him the same tired line about how this was a prison and not a summer camp, and you didn't get to pick your bunkies. I know that, Sarge, but... The inmate looked back at Carter as the man stared at the wall. He's been acting weird. He whispers to himself at night, and I think he might try to hurt me. If he tries, we'll come and save you. Till then, this is your house, so clean it up, Terry monotoned, before going back to counting. It was an hour later, as Terry tried to stay awake during his paperwork, when the pounding from the quad brought them around. Tombre asked Terry if he'd go check it out, and Terry was thankful for an excuse to walk around until he got to the floor and saw what was going on. Inmate Carter had closed himself and his roommate into the cell and was demanding to speak with the captain. He was holding his roommate in a headlock as he pressed a piece of jagged metal to his throat, threatening to kill him if he didn't get what he wanted. I want to be out of this quad, he screamed at Terry as he tried to reason with him. I want to be away from the whispers, I want to sleep without nightmares, and I want to be out of this cell. It was just he and Tombre that night. Sergeant Wayne had called out, and Terry was relaying information to Tombre and telling him to get the captain down here right away. Most of the inmates had already closed themselves in, not wanting to get wrapped up in any part of this, and before Terry quite knew it, he found himself alone on the quad. Their faces were pressed against the glass, watching it all unfold from the safety of their cells, but they were as good as miles away behind those steel doors. Tombre came in over the radio, telling him that the captain was getting a group together to come help. ETA was about 3 minutes, but it turned out they didn't have that long. Carter screamed suddenly, letting his roommate go as he clutched his ears and shouted his fear towards the ceiling. Only one way to make it stop, he gibbered, and then he plunged that piece of metal into his neck. Terry let the radio slip as he ran forward without thinking. He keyed the emergency lock on the rolling cell door, the roommate shooting out into the quad as the door came open. He went screaming for the inner door as Terry came into the cell, and as inmate Carter went to the ground, Terry put a hand on the spurting neck to try to stop the flow of blood. He shouldn't have gone into the cell with an unrestrained inmate. He shouldn't have been elbow deep in blood without gloves. Terry should have waited for medical and backup, but as he pressed against the ugly wound from which the piece of metal grew, his only thought was not watching this man die. Terry was looking into Carter's face, the crazy draining out right along with the blood, when the lights began to flicker inside the cell. The light coming from the window from the pole light in the yard cast them into an eerie glow, but Terry didn't feel fear until the lights in the quad went out as well. He could hear Tobry yelling over the radio he had left out in the quad, the roommate nowhere to be seen, and all Terry could think to do was keep his hands over the gushing wound in Carter's neck. He was shivering, the man convulsing against him as he looked into the murky darkness around him, and then he heard the catch release on the door to the cell next to his. "Give me my prey," came the whispering voice from his dreams as it slithered from that dark womb. Carter whimpered against him, trying to press himself against Terry like a frightened child. This was clearly what had driven him to the edge, and now it was here to get him. The gloopy sound of a legless horror could be heard pulling itself closer to the pair, and as they cowered in the dark, Terry felt certain that this was how he would die. The mouth would open up, just as it had so many times before, and swallow them both up. The team that was on their way would find nothing but an empty quad, and Terry would be just one more mystery for the guards and the inmates of Stragview to speculate on. Terry closed his eyes, bending protectively over Carter as the thing drug itself closer. When he peeked through slitted lids, he could see something like a multi-tentacled slug as it stood in the doorway of the cell. "Give him to me," it screeched, but as the lights came back on, Terry was momentarily blinded by the sudden intrusion. Something hit him in the chest then, and as he fell across the inmate, he heard boots slapping on concrete. Then there were people screaming his name. Carter was jerked away from him as strong hands helped him up, and Terry was being led out of the quad as people spoke to him in voices that sounded alien. He was aware of being in the station, the captain shaking him as he asked him what had happened. He was aware of being in the captain's office next, several people standing far too close as they discussed what was wrong with him. His life happened in little jumps and bumps, and finally he was in one of the back rooms in medical, staring off into nothing as he tried to stop himself from falling apart. Someone had put a blanket around him, and he was sitting in a stark white room on a bed they usually save for patients in need of care. He thought he was alone, but when someone cleared their throat, he realized that the warden was sitting near the counter, a file folder in his hand and a Cheshire Cat smile on his face. "Well, it seems you've finally come back to us, Officer Greenwood." Terry stared at him, uncomprehending, but seeming to have discovered his voice. What in the hell was that? The warden steepled his fingers, seeming to contemplate the answer. 20 years ago, there was an inmate named Frost. Frost was a bad man who liked to do bad things to children. He was serving a very long sentence, but someone decided to shorten it for him. They slammed his head against that wall so hard you could see his face in the wall for a while afterwards. We painted over it a few times, and it finally started to fade. After a little, we started putting people in that cell again, but something happened. We started seeing an increase in crazed inmates. They complained about voices, whispers, seeing things after lights out, and it drove more than one of them insane. After a while, we found a few of them dead, either by their own hands or something else's. We tried closing the cell, but it didn't work. Frost was angry, but Frost was also content to torture people who happened to find himself in his cell. We remembered how we'd gotten rid of that ugly indentation of his face in the concrete, and every month we painted the cell. We paint it with the thickest latex paint we can, and it takes him a little longer every time to come back. It's not a permanent solution, but it's the best we have. Terry sat there, taking all this in, trying to make sense of it, but coming up short. Why not just... But the warden put a hand up to stop him. "Whatever you're about to say, we've tried it. He's a monster, a disease, and he always comes back." He turned to go, stopping at the door as Terry looked after him. "Take the weekend off. Come back fresh on Monday. I'll have a crew in there tonight to paint that cell." and that will keep him in check for a little longer. Over the next 3 days, do what you have to do to forget what you've seen. Drink yourself into oblivion. Take sleep meds. Try to ignore what dreams might still linger. Don't let him stay. Push him out as best you can. Or one day, you might wake up to find that very same face on the wall of your own home, and will have to fill your position with something besides a layer of latex paint. Terry watched him go, not sure what to believe, but wanting nothing so much as the oblivion of a peaceful sleep, knowing he probably wouldn't get it. His chest ached suddenly, and he looked down at the bruise someone had treated there. They had laid his uniform shirt and undershirt across a nearby chair, and as Terry looked, he felt his mouth go very dry. The bruise on his chest looked like nothing so much as a formless blob, but the longer he looked, the more he could see the hooked nose and the hateful eyes that had stared back at him from the cell. It seemed that Frost might be harder to escape than even the warden had thought, and Terry just knew that as his eyelids tried to slide closed, he would find that gaping mouth waiting for him, and the cell would be his hell for all eternity. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. If you enjoyed tonight's story, why not go ahead and subscribe if you're not already subscribed? Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the spooky stuff we do here. If you'd like to get a copy of my latest book, there's a link below. Or if you'd like to support the show more monetarily, you can always come down to Patreon. I have many tiers. I'm sure you'll find something that interests you. If you're interested in my books, I always recommend my Ghostly Reader tier. Ghostly Readers get a copy of my book signed on their doorstep anytime I write one, which is at least twice a year. Patrons always get their spooky a little bit early, so they can enjoy them before that night's premiere. And speaking of patrons, let's go ahead and thank them. Thanks to Janet and Winters for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributors, and thanks to Xaronana, Emily Coltsfoot, Martha, Marianne Schuler, Jennifer Damron, and Tyler Parker for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. Thanks, guys. We just couldn't do the show without you. I'm sure by now you can see some videos appearing at the end here. If you think you might like a little more spooky, why not go ahead and click on another one? I'm sure you can handle a little bit more. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.